There. Now I'm no longer on mute. So let me restart that. Welcome to my first live stream. Have you noticed it's my first live stream? There's going to be an issue where the latency settings, so what you see is going to be behind what I do by about 5, 6 seconds. So if you type something like the people who are typing audio now, by the time you hear it, you should hear me. And I'm going to take by the fact that, yes, thank you for letting me know that you got the audio. I feel like saying this is my first day because it kind of is with the live streaming. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Kwong. I've been in the Salesforce environment for over 10 years now. I've been a co-leader for the Madison user group for multiple years. I've been a Salesforce MVP for multiple years. And I co-created the Flonatics way back ago at a Dreamforce with Mark Ross. And Flow's been kind of my thing for the last many years, and I'm very excited that it is now the direction that Salesforce is going with automation. But there's a lot of automation that people have created. We have had workflow rules, we've had process builder, we've had flows, we've had Apex, and those are all things that you can do automation in Salesforce, but not everything is going to stay. At Dreamforce, they made the illusion that workflow rules and process builders will be eventually going away. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how can we take a workflow rule that we already have and turn it into flow. And there's a lot of considerations to make depending upon what your automations are doing. And we're going to start really simple. And then we'll see how the time goes. We may get a little bit more complicated in today's live stream, but I plan on doing more of these. If people find it useful and helpful, please let me know. You can add a comment on the video. You can hit the like button, all the good YouTube stuff you're supposed to do. Or just let me know on Twitter that this is something that you want to see more of and it's useful, so I know that it's worth the time to go through and do these. So let's start. We'll minimize me. We'll open up Salesforce here, and we're looking at workflow rules. So this is a developer org that I have that I've been using for a while for flow training. And I actually have a couple workflow rules in the system, and we're going to migrate at least one of these, maybe both of them. Let's start by taking a look at the workflow rule itself. We're going to start with opportunity closed one. So for people who maybe aren't familiar with workflow rules, they're kind of set up into two sections. The first one is what's called the criteria, and then the second one is the actions. And so the criteria is basically when should this workflow rule perform the actions. So we can see a few things here. One is the rule criteria, and it's really simple. It's when the opportunity stage is closed won. The other thing is there are a couple of options with the rules, and that's how they evaluate. They can always run. So if you edit this opportunity to be closed won, you save, it'll run the actions. You edit again, even if you don't make any changes at this stage, it will run the actions again. You could have it run when things are created, or the one that tends to be the most common is right off over here where it's evaluating the criteria when the record is created or it's edited to subsequently meet the criteria. And that means the stage has to actually get moved to closed won. So you can edit the opportunity over and over again after that, and the workflow actions for this rule won't fire. Once we get the criteria for the running of the rule out of the way, we have the actions, and we have two on this particular workflow rule. And that's an email alert and a field update. So in this case, we're updating the account of the opportunity to be the type customer, and then we're sending this email alert. So this is a very simple but kind of a common workflow rule that people have where you're saying, hey, I need to do email notifications. I'm going to do some field updates. And we're going to start and change this to be a flow. So the first thing we have to do is go to flows. So I'm going to type flow in the quick find. And we'll take a look at all our flows. You can see I have a whole bunch of flows in here. And we first have to decide what type of flow are we going to create. So when I click new flow, we have a few options. We have a screen flow, we have record triggered, we have scheduled, we have platform, we have auto launch. Now, for workflow rules, you're pretty much never going to be using screen flows. Screen flows are really good when you're showing end user information or you're asking the end user to make choices and decisions. Typically, screen flows get called by button clicks or are placed in a component of your Lightning page. But when it comes to automation, like workflow rules and changing over to process builder, we want things to happen when records get created or edited. So we're going to be using record trigger flows. So we're going to select that, click next, and now we can choose our layout. So we have freeform and we have auto layout. Auto layout's technically beta. There are some circumstances where the auto layout will not work for your flow. Most likely it will be fine to use the auto layout if you're migrating a workflow rule over to flow. The main reason why you may not want to use that is if you're kind of picky how your elements are kind of looking on the page, or if you need to have one element go back to a different element earlier in the flow and it's not using a standard loop. You can't auto layout kind of assumes your flow moves linearly downwards and never comes back up unless it's specifically done in a loop element. So we'll do auto layout because I think that's the most common for most people to get started with. So we'll click that. And here we are. We got our blank flow canvas. So I'm not going to make the assumption that everyone who is watching this has built a flow. So I'm going to use a few navigation terms for you. This big section on the screen that you see here, I call this the canvas. It is basically where we're going to paint our flow. On the left-hand side, if we weren't using the auto layout, this is where we would select our elements or the paint colors, if you will, for our canvas. It's also where we can create what are called resources, which is basically a generic term for something that's going to hold information. And we'll talk about that in a second. But because we're using the auto layout, for the most part, everything we're going to do is going to be right on the canvas. And the first thing we need to look at is the start item. So this is literally where the flow starts. You can see we have trigger and a run flow something, and we have choose object. We need to click edit for the trigger, and we can take a look at all the options. We can run it when a record is created, when it's updated, when it's created or updated, or even if it's deleted. And then we have a choice between do we happen before the record is saved to the server or after the record is saved. Now for workflow rules, you may have some workflow rules that are only firing when it's created, and then you could use the exact same thing. But in our case, we're going to be doing this if an opportunity is created or updated. So that kind of mirrors what we have in our workflow rule. To determine whether or not you want to run it before or after really depends upon the actions you're doing in your workflow rule. My general rule of thumb is if I'm doing anything that is updating the record that is not triggering the flow, so in this case, we're not updating the opportunity, it's going to be an after the record is saved type flow. And that's because we want the opportunity completely in the system and good to go before we do any other actions. So if we think back to our workflow rule, we have two actions, one being an email alert and the other one being a field update. So if our email alert is containing information about the fields of the opportunity, that's probably something we would want to send after it's saved. So the email template that's being used when it does the merge fields, it has all the values from after the record being saved. And we're also updating the account. And You remember I said that if you're updating anything other than the record that started the flow, we're going to do after. So after the record to save is the way to go. The next step is choosing the object. So this one's pretty easy. We know we're firing on opportunities because our workflow rule is using opportunities. So we'll select an opportunity. And now we have a criteria. So the thing when it comes with criteria is it's very similar to the workflow rules. It's helping decide when should the flow run. And this may get more complicated depending upon what you actually are doing for workflow rules. We're going to go really, really simple today. We're essentially going to make a 1-to-1 flow workflow rule to flow. Thank you. Chat just told me the Salesforce break that on Winter 22, the initial screen of before save and after save selection has changed. So great example of the fact that Salesforce seems to be making updates a lot faster than I can make and edit videos. Anyways, so our criteria for our workflow rule was the stage was closed once. So we're going to mimic that. And we are simply select stage. It's using the API name, which is stage name, equals. And then here's all our pick list values. We select closed one. We don't have any other conditions. And then we have two options. So this is an example of the criteria evaluation that we have in workflow rules. And essentially we're going to mimic this. So we don't want this flow to run every time an opportunity that's closed one is edited. We only want it at the first time that that opportunity has been marked as closed one. So we're going to select when the record is updated to meet the conditions. That means that if the stage is currently closed one and we edit the opportunity, this flow won't fire. But if we just changed it to become closed one, it will fire. So we're going to start with our first action, and I'm going to actually do this a little bit backwards, and we're going to start off with updating the account. So the type of the account is customer. There's a couple of different ways we can handle this. The simplest, shortest way is we click on the plus sign here to add an element, and we select update records. And in this particular situation, what we're going to be doing is saying we're going to update the account based off of the ID of the account matching the ID of the opportunity. Now, when we're trying to grab information about the opportunity, we have to select the resource for the opportunity. And for record trigger flows, there is two items that represent the record that triggered this flow. We have record and record prior. So record is what is the values right now after the change has been made. Record prior would be what are the values prior to the record being made. There are circumstances where you might want to use record prior, but for today we're using just plain old record because we want it as it is right now. And we're going to select the account ID. And I'm going to go back for 1 second because I want to show you how this is set up. So when I type in an account, you can see that there's two options here. We have account with a little greater than sign here, and then we have just account ID. The difference is the account ID is the actual field on the opportunity. Whereas if we clicked on this little greater than sign, we can now grab values from the account itself. We don't need to do that for this particular flow because all we need is the account. If I can type properly, let's just start this all over. We just need the account ID. We don't need to be navigating to the account and then do stuff. So we have, hey, we're going to update the account. The account we're going to update is based off of the account ID of the opportunity, and the field on the account is the type, and we get to pick the value. So we're going to make it customer. That's it. That's the equivalent of doing our field update from our account, from our workflow rule. I usually do something different where I'm actually getting records and I'm storing variables and doing assignments, but that's a personal preference. There are times where you wouldn't want to use that. Well, if you are curious, you can look at some of my past videos on the channel, or I'm sure we'll be doing more of these, and we'll get into it. But now that we've done the update, we're going to send our email alert. This is one of the nice things that I really like about flow and workflow rules when you're trying to migrate. When I add an element here, I have this interaction called action. And this is a whole bunch of different things in the system. Flow can do a lot more than workflow rules can do. We can do chatter posts. We can send push notifications. We can do custom email. But what I really like is we can also do email alerts. So the email alert that I already created and I'm using for my workflow rule, I can reuse. Ignore the fact that I can't spell notification, but closed one notification. I like to be as clear as possible. Excuse me, I've gotten to the point in my life where I can no longer talk about one thing and type something completely different. I like to make sure that when I'm labeling things in Flow, that I'm labeling them so if I look at it, I immediately know what it is. I don't want to have to come back in 6 months and go, oh, what is this? Have to click and open it and spend more time. I also like to put some description information in here. Usually I'll put something a little bit more specific. For example, I might go through and put a link to where we have the documentation for this process. We might put the link for or more details on why we're doing it this particular way, or if I made changes, I will reference the date when I make the change just so I can keep track of items. For the email alert, I have to say what record we're actually using for the email alert, and that's going to be our opportunity ID. And you recall that's the opportunity is the record in this example. And we hit done. That's it. We've migrated the workflow rule. We need to do something first before it works, and that's we got to save this. So we'll go ahead and save. Labeling your flows is going to be really important. Depending on how you want to proceed when you're doing your migration and additional automation, some people are going to create multiple flows per object. So you might have a whole bunch of different flows for opportunities. Some may choose to do something like you create one flow for creating and editing and a separate flow for just creating, and then you're using subflows or a lot of decision tree elements to do different actions based on the information in the record. There's pros and cons to each method. I'm not going to get into today. Do know that the subflow option for record trigger flows is a Winter 22 feature, so that's not something I can show today. But we're going to go on the operation that we are going to have multiple flows in our system, and that means labeling is important. I always like to start the label with the object that's involved, because then they all group together in the flow list. So this is going to be the opportunity closed one actions, doing more than just a notification. These are all actions that need to occur automatically when an opportunity is closed one after save. Most of the time you can leave it at that. There are some advanced options here where you can set API versions, change the type. When you're doing migration, you pretty much can ignore this. So we're going to save. And that's it. We are done. At this point, All we need to do is activate it, which means we need to deactivate the workflow rule first. So let's go back. We'll click deactivate. And we can activate this, or we can run the debugger. I always recommend that you debug your flows, and you should do that either using the debug option that we have on the screen, or alternatively, we're going to go through and activate it and then run some tests, because this is something you are not doing in production. Right? Right. You're either doing this in a dev org like we are today, or you're using a sandbox and doing it in your sandbox, because if you make a mistake and it's in production, you are now disrupting people's jobs and potentially having an adverse impact on your data. So let's start with, how does this debug work when it's a record trigger flow? So the first thing we have is, when we hit debug, is going through and selecting some options. So one of them is skipping the start conditions. This would be used, for an example, if you just want the flow to run. And I'm actually going to select that because I can't fake the opportunity getting edited to be closed one. So I'm going to skip that. There are an option to actually run the flow as a different user, and there are some times where that is nice to do. There's a setting you have to change to be able to allow you to do that. I really like doing that, especially with screen flows where they're running from the perspective of the running user. Typically don't need to do that for record trigger flows. And then we have to select an opportunity. I just realized I don't think I have a test opportunity ready to go. So let's go find one. Opportunities. Let's see. We have to have an opportunity in here. Oh yeah, we have all the fake opportunities in there. We'll just, let's see. Do we have any? Here's one that's closed one. We'll use this one for Express Logistics Standby Generator. Sure. Let's do that. All right. So Express Standby Generator. And then we're going to run the flow as if the record was updated, because that's essentially what we're spoofing here, and we'll run it. Now what happens is we see a yellow line for what the flow went through. And if there was an error, that yellow line would not make it to the end. This flow is really simple. We only have 2 elements in here, so it's just straight through. The nice thing is what we're seeing on the debug details side panel over here. We can see how's the interview started. This is a weird carryover. Salesforce bought the product that it became Flow, and back then everything, when a flow was running, it was called an interview. And I'm pretty sure it was because the original product was designed to walk people through like a phone interview system. And that's just carried over. So when you see the word interview, it's really, hey, it's a flow that's been running. We can see it was run as a debug. We can see the user who ran it. We can see what API version. We get the ID of the record, the start time. We can see if it met the start time conditions, but we skipped it. And then we get to the update record. So it's saying update account. That's this one right here. And we can see what its account it is. So there's the ID of the account, update the direct. And we can see what the result is. It says, hey, all the records that met the filter criteria are ready to be updated. Great. And when we get down to the email alert for the opportunity, and then we get a rollback because we're in test mode, and it's finished. It's working. It's done. So we can activate it and go on our merry way. I may, in normal circumstances, actually go edit an opportunity and make sure that it's working. And that's exactly what I'm going to do, because I'm paranoid when it comes to things. Let's see if I can get to the right tab. There we go. So the first thing I want to do is go to the account and change the type. All right. I'm going to change that to prospect. Let's come back. Now we know the particular automation is only going to run when it's marked as closed one. So we're going to mark that need to change the stage to be something else. And now we'll go ahead and close our opportunity. Select closed one, hit save. No errors. This is always a good thing. And we can come back. There's our type. Refresh the screen. And my phone just buzzed to tell me I got an email. And you can see now the type has changed. So the flow is working. This is the absolute bare minimum that you can do. There are some things you need to be aware of, though. If there's an error in this flow, it may prevent the user from actually proceeding and saving the record. There is this thing called an Apex execution email, which will be going to, by default, the person who last modified this flow, and that includes activating it. That's probably going to be you as the admin. And when that happens, you'll get a message that looks very similar to our debug panel, and you can come in and take a look and figure out what's wrong. So common reasons, if we think about what could go wrong with this particular flow, would be something like you go to update the account, but that account is old and it hit a validation error. That has nothing to do with the customer or changing the type to be customer. Salesforce has to follow the validation rules. You hit the validation rules, you can't update the account, so this fails. And then you're kind of stuck. But there are certain things that we can do where we can create what are called fault lines. So when I click on this, you can see there's an option here to add a fault path. If you're not using the auto layout, essentially when you are connecting your elements together, you would connect this to where you want to go when everything's working, and then you get to do a second connection as a fault path. For the auto layout, you click add a fault path, and you get this nice dotted red line to say, what do you want to have happen when it goes wrong? And you have to decide what you want to do here. This is how flows can fail somewhat gracefully. Examples of things that I've done in the past are an email action to go through and say, hey, this is a problem. Not necessarily a big problem to do now that we're getting those really nice emails from Salesforce to debug when flows go wrong. But I might send an email to the person who closed won the opportunity to let them know, hey, the account didn't get updated. You need to manually go update that account. If I was using a screen flow, I would rather show a screen to say, hey, this is what the problem is. The other thing that you can do is you can just have it go and do the normal action. Now, that's less easy to do when we're using auto layout. So I would end up having to repeat my opportunity action. So at least the email for the opportunity notification will go live. But if we turn off auto layout, you can see that I still get the second line. And if I go over here and let's place a fake assignment on for right now, just so we have something. If I drew a line here, I now get my fault line. So you could draw the line and go straight to the email alert so you can get that. Right? That's certainly an option if you're doing it this way. The better way would be to swap these and go, well, I know that the opportunity notification is not going to error out, but the account would. So you could go through and instead of doing the update first, you could have done the email notification, and then all you have to do is have a fault line and the flow can end. So you got to kind of think of how you want to do this a little bit more with flow, especially when you're dealing with fault lines, than you have to do with workflow rules. Because workflow rules, if there's a validation error, there's a validation error. With flow, it respects that. So that's it for this particular flow. If we look back, I do have another workflow rule. And this is for when the stage has changed to opportunity negotiation. And this is an example where I'm doing a field update to the actual opportunity. So I'm going to actually create a flow for this because it's a little bit different. And the fact that it is creating the flow, or rather, it is updating the record that triggered the flow. So if you remembered back when we were first choosing the type of flow that we were building, one of the options was, do you have it happen before or after the save? And I said, well, if you're doing anything to something other than the opportunity or the record that launched it, then you should do after. This is an example, something where we're updating the actual opportunity itself so we could do before. So we're going to do that because we got time. I'm going to move a little bit quicker, though, because things have it. Manny in the chat said, even if you create a fault line, an error email is still generated. That's correct. Yeah, Salesforce is going to still send you an email alert to say that there was an error. So it'll even tell you in the email message that you get that there was a fault line and the flow proceeded down the fault line. Record is created or updated before the record is saved because we're updating the opportunity itself. We choose our object. And this is for when the stage is changed to, I forgot. What does my workflow rule say? I should look at that. It's changed to negotiation and review. Under normal circumstances, I would actually have my workflow rule up on a different monitor so I can use it as a reference and I don't have to go back and forth. Same thing here. We're going to go through and say that it meets the conditions because we don't want this happening every single time. And now we have some choices. You can see the items that we can select here are different. There's no actions. So we couldn't send an email alert if we wanted to. We can't create records. We can update records, but when it comes to before trigger flows like this one is, I like to use the assignment. And the reason I like to use the assignment is because it is literally all I need to do. That triggered the flow. So we're going to select record, and the field we're changing is next step. Let's look at what our field update is saying. Our field update is saying call the prospect to negotiate the contract. So we have some choices here because it's doing string, but we can just type it in here. We also don't need quotes or anything like that for string. So we can just hit done. And that's it. We're done. That's it. We don't have to do anything else. So let's save our flow. This is for negotiation review before. Opportunity is saved. And let's debug this. Let the debug. And let's change our stage to negotiation and review. And let's get rid of our... Oh, you know what? I have to deactivate the workflow rule. There we go. There we go. Deactivate the workflow rule. Go back to the opportunity. Let's save. Okay, next step is blank. Stage is negotiation review. Let's use the same opportunity. Hit run. And here's the debug information. Oh, the trigger and record did not meet the conditions. And that's because of the fact that I have it so it only updates if I changed the stage to be negotiation review. So I need to make some changes. So we need to skip the start conditions, keep everything else, hit run. We can see our flow started. We hit the assignment. We can see that the value for the record of next step is call prospect to negotiate contract. and it works. But you'll see that it's blank here. And it's blank here because we're in the debug mode, and so it rolled back the change that it made. But that's okay. We're done. We're activating this. Let's go actually test this functionally. Let's change the stage to be outside negotiation. Confirm next step is blank. Oh yeah, maybe I should probably call them. That's way overdue. Click negotiation review. Click mark as current stage. And there, magically, call prospect to negotiate contract is in the next step. So there we go. We've migrated almost 2 full flows. The only thing that is left in this other flow was creating a task. However, I wanted to show you that you can use that before option for updating the opportunity. And so we can't actually create tasks in that particular flow. You would need to have one that fires afterwards. So if I was going to do this, I would probably split this into 2 flows. And the reason for that is if you're doing a before trigger flow to update the record that is being that's running the flow, it's substantially faster than having to do an after update to then update the record again. And if you think about that, there's a whole bunch of things that Salesforce does in the order execution. If you're curious, you can do a search for Salesforce order execution in Google. There's a long, long list. And if you are having to wait until after the record is saved, it has to go through the whole list first. Then you're editing the opportunity again to make the change. And then it goes through the whole list of executions once again. It will be the equivalent of me going in, editing the stage, hitting save, going, I forgot something, coming back, editing the opportunity again. It's editing the record more than once, and that takes longer. Now, in this particular circumstance, you probably wouldn't have noticed much, but as your org gets more and more complicated and your automation gets more complicated, it will start being noticeable. That's all I have today. I was planning on going for an hour. It is 1:40 Central Time on my clock. I see in the chat, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask about migrating their flow workflow rows into Flow? And we'll wait a few minutes as we deal with the wonderful thing that is latency. While I'm waiting, let's talk about why you may want to have only one flow per object, or maybe a couple flow per objects. The main thing with that is right now, there's not a good way to organize your flow list. Real list views, I think, are coming, but I can't remember when. The best you can do is use the filter here and kind of filter based on the name of the flow, or use good naming conventions to keep everything grouped together. The one thing that you can also do that is beneficial is if you had, let's say, 7 flows that all ran when the opportunity is modified, and you had similar criteria, meaning that someone could edit the opportunity and it could meet the criteria of more than one of those flows at a time, then you have 2 flows that are running concurrently, or not concurrently, but are running at the same time for that same edit. And that's not ideal. One of the reasons it's not ideal is you have no control over which of those flows fire first. And I'd be curious to know, it may actually take more time to run 2 flows than run 1. That's something I'm going to have to test and actually time to find out. But if you moved everything into a single flow and used decision elements to basically decide which actions to perform, basically your decision becomes the equivalent of a workflow rule, then you do have control over the order of operations. But there's a lot more you have to consider when you're building that particular flow. It'll work more like a process builder. As a matter of fact, that's probably what we'll look at going down the line, is how to take a process and migrate it to Flow. And you might think that's really simple because Process Builders actually creates a flow behind the scenes. But if you've ever looked at one, it can look really weird. And if you're the one that's going to have to maintain it, you want to make sure it's clear and concise and understandable for you and anyone else that has to look at it. So, that being said, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure you like the stream so I know that we want to do more of these. If you have topics you would like me to cover, let me know what you would like to have me cover. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Have a good day.